My concerns and interest in the field of literacy tend toward where we are headed, and in this sense, embracing the very complex situation that teachers of literacy find themselves in today. Teachers are generally stuck between the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, it is their entrusted duty to teach the knowledge and learning that has been accumulated in the past, to teach it to students in the present in such a way that they can use that knowledge to guide them through the future. But where we might have some idea, and certainly curriculum development is all about what has gone on in the past, where we are headed in the future is a good deal more opaque and complex. By this I mean that the entire premises that we have based literacy education on for the past few centuries seems to have changed quite dramatically. Here we sit or stand in a marvelous institution, the Black Diamond being a global treasure and one which preserves the accumulated knowledge that has been derived through print literacy. Being built in 1991, this particular building came into being on the eve of this great change in the field of literacy. Shortly after, we were to see the inauguration of the internet. The internet has, in many ways, shifted people's conception of what it means to be a reader and a writer. The presentation that I've prepared for you today has to do with a very particular aspect of what we might think of as the new field of literacy in education. I've presented it as automated writing and the future of network literacy. These ideas, although seeming a bit abstract or perhaps unusual, are really anything but. In order to get here, I got on an automatic train. The automatic train I paid for with an automatic machine. I checked the time and my schedule, wholly automated on my phone. I then took the train. I checked in for my plane automatically. I got on the plane, and although the pilots were there to tell us passengers some jokes, the plane basically flew itself. It landed itself, and I got here. Almost all of my traveling over both land and air networks was conducted either entirely or with the assistance of automation. Automation has become one of the most dominant features of the literacy landscape today. And it's that feature that I would like to address, especially for those people whose job it is to help the youth of today understand what their roles as readers and writers mean in a world where their interactions with language, with text, and what have you, almost exclusively happen through automation. Probably most people here have one of these devices on them. Whoops, one of those too. Probably most people have one of these, probably much better than mine. Mine's not very good. Which means they have come to the place now where they communicate most frequently on a mobile networked device. I would start with a little background on some of my research, just to present where I come from. But I'd also like to make mention of a grad student that I have, whose research has been conducted in early childhood education. She has a 6-month-old child and conducted a study both with her own child and the child of her sister's family, who is 2 years old. They gave the children iPads. The children proceeded to make videos with their iPads. They really took almost no instruction from the parents. They just used them as toys. The astounding thing is that within a very short period of time, the 6-month-old was able to turn on the iPad, to open it, to find the correct application, to shoot the video, to save the video, to be able to go and find the video in the files, and to watch it. Why is that important? This child had not yet mastered speech. In 1971, Janet Emig, a literacy theorist, she wrote a very influential book called Decomposing Processes of 12th Graders. She comments in her work that we know very little about the composing process. Composition still seems something like the black box in an airplane. What's important about that is she was surveying any way that she could discover what we knew about it. This places writing as one aspect, the expressive side of the print literacy equation, in stark contrast to the other side, the receptive side, reading. Reading has been the subject of a great deal of very interesting, very thorough research. And what we know about reading is that people quite early on develop what is commonly called automaticity. This being the ability of a reader to not sound out every syllable if they are working with an alphabetic type of language, but to recognize words by their basic shape and then to read much more quickly. That basic process, of course, is essential for somebody who needs to become fluent and therefore succeed in their education. But what would it take for the writer to become fluent? We don't know. If we don't know then very much about the writing process and what goes on for composition of 12th graders, we don't know a lot more now than we did when Janet Emig wrote her book. How much more complex is it to understand what is going on in the mind of a pre-verbal 6-month-old child? In order to look into this, we need to understand exactly what are the challenges that we are facing when we want to go and teach writing to a generation who then are learning to write online. They will be the first generation to do so. The child could, if it had wanted to, very easily, with the click of a single button, have posted her work to the internet, to YouTube. This enters yet another new feature into the equation of literacy. As I'm sure you are well aware, for years publishing was a complicated process and involved many stages of processes of writing, but also, of course, many stages in the process of publishing. Now, people can publish almost instantly. This does, of course, change the entire landscape. It means that everybody, almost instantly, becomes a writer. That is, anybody who is busy writing and blogging and using the internet or using their phones are actually out there publishing their work. As a reaction to that, of course, we wind up with a very special situation in that the amount of information available and accessible is expanding exponentially. So allow me then to just briefly talk a little bit about the research that brings me here. I spent a few years studying something that most people would just like to see disappear entirely. I have in the past had an interest in waste and garbage. One often thinks of those things as odious and unpleasant, especially in their physical manifestation, but we very seldom consider those things as something related to our vaulted practices of literacy. But the fact is, not only do we live in a physical environment, we live in a mental, and I would like to shift that a little bit, and to say an information environment. Our environments here, for example, in the Black Diamond, is one well-preserved, well-chosen. It's a great treasure. But that's not true of every environment. And in fact, many environments are not so pleasant as this one, nor so well kept, maintained, and safeguarded. And in this instance, what I decided to study was spam. And not the little cans of food, if you can call it that. And being a vegetarian, I don't. But spam email. To get a general perspective on spam, we can say that today, during this conference, some 87 billion spam messages will be sent. 87,000,000,000 in one day. Many of those messages will go into spam filters. Many of them will be bounced back. They will bounce back to non-existent addresses, and as a result, there's that many more messages traveling through our information environment. Very, very few people want spam. It's not very good stuff. If you are gullible and decide you are going to go for the $12 million you've been offered from a Nigerian bank account, you may be in for a big surprise. Much of it is fraudulent. It is fishing for your information. It wants to find out all about you. It hopes you will respond. 87 billion messages a day. If we thought of a similar kind of event in the world, our physical world, we would start to think, my goodness, but that is a lot of waste that we are just casting into our environments. And certainly it is. And based on that, I started to study this as a process of automation. Note that almost all, 87 billion messages, are not sent by a human. They are sent by what is commonly known as a netbot, that is, a network robot. The messages go out, and probably you don't see 87 million messages in your inbox. That's because you have spam filters. And your spam filters are very, very good. We wonder, how do those filters become so good that on any given day you might see none, or one, or maybe 2 messages enter your inbox? Well, it is a very interesting story. And it is a story which in some ways describes the love affair between robots. Your spam filter trains itself on your writing behaviors. It knows the kinds of messages you will probabilistically receive. It also knows the kinds of things you are likely to write about and be interested in. Spam filters use various algorithms, and the algorithms are iterative and accumulate knowledge over time. That is, every time you send or receive a legitimate message, the machine is learning. It's not artificial intelligence, meaning it's not inventing and coming up with new ideas for you, but it is machine learning. It is becoming very knowledgeable about you and the way you write. We can say that in many cases, spam filters that use Bayesian or Markovian probability know more about your literacy practices than you do. If that seems disturbing, we can be thankful because, like in the movie WALL-E, these spam filters are busy cleaning up the devastated environment which is our network, and trying to clean it enough so that you can cope. Many of us experience that we are suddenly inundated and having a great deal of information to deal with. If we think that in this world we might receive on any given day 40, 50, 60 emails, at least a portion of which we should respond to, I'm sure I'm not alone in that situation, then we start to see that already we need assistance. We need things that help us to deal with the excess of information in our environment. And as we have everybody able to share in this world and to publish and contribute to our environment, we now have a counter problem. It is not just how to educate people to produce texts, but how to help them to cope with the sheer volume of texts that are in our environment. If I have an agenda in speaking to you today, it is that I think we need to attend to our information environment. And in much the same way that people around the world are starting to recognize the absolute importance of environmentalism and paying attention to what is happening to our physical environment on Earth, we simultaneously will need to start paying attention to what is happening to our information environment. And that is not just the physical space around us, but our headspace. Automation both creates the problem and offers us some solutions to it. So that is the premise on which I'd like to now discuss with you ways to approach the idea of teaching writing to youth today to help them to navigate and cope with a very different information environment than the one that probably all of us grew up in. If you would like a little bit of background on some of this, since I won't have time to cover all the details, that is my website, and you will see in particular, if you'd like to see some of the research, I've posted it on that website. I'm going to start with a broad, general, and idealized viewpoint on what is going on with language. This schema simply sets up a tripartite version of language, generally speaking, and how we engage with it as an environment. In this, I posit a differentiation, though obviously overlapping, between language as a social force, language as a cultural force, and language as an individual form of engagement with our world. In particular, this schema sets up that we have, in fact, some conflicting forces in language. These forces have always had a generative kind of conflict. Within the bottom sphere of culture, where I have written cultural discourses, I think you might think of the Black Diamond as an excellent example of an institution which preserves our cultural discourses. To some degree, this is where the traditions of language reside. It is where we come to understand forms. In other words, it takes a fairly long time for some new form to become established and preserved. And those happen through processes of publishing and sharing work. In that cultural sphere, we would understand our genres and our great long-lasting discourses. And over there to your right or left, depending on which way I'm facing, we would see social and the social practice version of an understanding of literacy. And in this understanding of literacy, this is where we foment new change. This is where new words enter the language. This is where our practices help us to define our immediate communities, our understandings of the world, ways that we use language when we are speaking hip or slang, or those kinds of things. And gradually, as they become sedimented over time, they enter into our cultural discourses. I'm introducing nothing new with that idea. In fact, the brilliant Russian formalist theorist Mikhail Bakhtin would have said very similar things about the process of the carnivalesque and the way that a new generation of writers always tries to take apart and take down the world that it enters, to invent, to be new, to revivify, to bring life into its culture. And by the trick of fate, if they are successful and live long enough to see it, their work will in fact become a part of the establishment, and that within their own lifetime, perhaps new writers will rise up and treat them as the boring, dull, old guard of literature in need of a new turning of the spade like compost. In this, which I won't spend too much time on, this particular graphic, I would like to suggest, first of all, it's idealized, it's never so well balanced. There are stronger influences and lesser influences, some people entirely within books and absorbing that world, others entirely within the fresh present tense of the excitement of their spoken word scenario, and they are performing what they call poetry but have not read a word of it, which is fine. We can see that these things are not ever so neatly balanced and that they are always pushing and pulling against each other. The language purists would say, do not enter those new ridiculous words into our dictionary. Words such as Google, which, by the way, was a spelling mistake. They had meant to write G-O-O-G-O-L, meaning an infinite, well, not an infinite number, but I think 1 times 10 to the 100 or something, 100th power. In fact, it was only a spelling mistake. And why is that funny? Because one of the features that has made Google the most popular search engine in the world is its "did you mean" function. So when you type in a spelling mistake, it tells you you're wrong, even though it's named after its own spelling mistake. Maybe that's why Google decided to make so many improvements to your use of language. It trained its robots to help you spell because they couldn't. In this scenario, we've entered a new dynamic right here. Right along what I've called a semiotic vector, that is a vector of signs, right down the area of expertise, experts being the gatekeeper between the social practice, fomenting all the new stuff, the exciting stuff, the change, and the cultural gatekeepers, the experts who know how it's supposed to be done, what the values are that it's conveying, and so on. And the thing that is penetrating that little triangle are robots. They are the force of automation entering right there. Let's take a look. If we think about how to teach students under the guise of this complex situation in which we have entered a new other, our automated other, the other that we communicate with every time we phone a bank, press 1 for, press 2 for, and what do? You press 0, right? You got good at that. You understood, press the 0 and a human being will answer. Well, at least you kept your fingers crossed. Because you knew that if you got frustrated with the robot and hung up, you had to go through it all over again. It asked you all kinds of questions. And it said, I heard you say. It keeps repeating things after you. It's remembering your voice. It's doing all kinds of things to interact with you. Why don't you want to talk to it? Because it's frustrating, and it actually doesn't give you the answers that you want. It's got its own thing going on, and sometimes you just want to blah, 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 blah. Did you mean? It repeats back to you. Did you mean blah, blah, blah? So, one of the ideas that I would like to present to you today, and I think this is crucial, I think that for a long time, educators of literacy, especially those teaching the young how to write, have made an inadequate separation between form on the one hand and content on the other. This particular tendency strikes me as somewhat Descartesian. And if we can think then that many people have claimed that mind and body were somewhat arbitrarily and falsely differentiated through that particular philosophical tradition, we can see that we are still holding on to some of this same problem, and that what we are not adequately doing is helping students to work with form and content in unison. The problem here is the way we perceive some of those things, so that most writing, when the writing teacher goes to assign the student some writing, the typical thing is to give them a couple provisos. One of which is, write it in your own words. To which any self-respecting student ought to answer, I don't have any. By the very nature of language, if it is my word, it's not a word. Because I'm supposed to have words that everybody shares. So right away, I've been given an impossible task. Number two, I am given a kind of constraint, and my constraint is almost always exclusively content-based. Write about dinosaurs. That's what I'm told. It would be wrong of me as a student to put up my hand and say, how? That's a very scary question. To a large degree, our students are taught by people who can write, but don't know how come they know how to write. They simply mastered language. And when pushed to answer that question, they will usually resort to the answer, well, I've done a lot of reading. I've learnt from great writers. I am a good student of literature. And certainly, that is traditionally how we have come to master the art, the craft, the utility of writing practices. Our forms are given to us through those who were great masters, nay, geniuses. They fed our minds in rich and important ways, and we learnt to work with those forms and do so ourselves. Maybe not as well, but we achieved personal expression, and that's what was important. Once again, here we stand in a venerable institution which houses the kinds of works and texts that we should be learning those skills from. That's wonderful, but let us remember that there are some provisos that we will get to about our new information environment and the texts there. Remember, the information environment is very busy, it's very full. And most people don't have the time to read a whole book. You must be joking. In fact, if one studies the art of web design, we know that most people decide if they will read something within about 1/10 of a second. Here's some information we can draw from the endless studies done by people such as Google, that we look at something and then we go away very quickly if it doesn't look like something we need to read. In fact, we know that most people will not read anything longer in print than the screen on which it appears. I'm sure some of you, I know I've had this experience of opening a document, and the document is opened in Microsoft Word or some such program, and then it opens. And slowly but surely, I see the blue scroll bar shrinking and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the page numbers increasing and increasing. Terror. I'm wondering if I can get a robot to read it for me. That would be super. What I'm getting at is the nature of the forms that we encounter, thus the forms that teach us, are changing radically. They are becoming more and more microscopic. We might have a broad and general knowledge. We might be surfing and picking up lots of useful little facts, but this will be in contradistinction to the broad, deep, I will read this giant tome written by Sigmund Freud and it will help me to understand what's wrong with me. So let us consider then some ways that we can tackle that issue. First, I would like to suggest that a field to which I am very committed and has a growing decent reputation within the field of academic research is that of inquiry. It may be that to some degree we need to rethink the entire premise on how we research the processes of writing. As I suggested, in the 32, some odd years since Janet Emig did her study, not a lot has changed. We haven't found out that much more. We suggested that there was a writing process, and this was a giant breakthrough, and people like Michael Apple, et cetera, gave us lots of good ideas about how to pre-plan and think about things and get students working and then edit and draft and redraft and all this kind of thing. And it's almost as if fate had a trick up its sleeve for them, because just as they were helping those students to understand that you don't just write it and hand it in, you should at least read it once through, because you might have a lot of spelling errors. So just read it once before you give it to me to read, just once. Just as we were getting to the point to help our students understand that there is a process involved in composition, not just the product. We are not just a Ford factory, but in fact we also could engage in this process. It could be meaningful. We could not only learn to write, we could write to learn. And just as those ideas were beginning to crystallize within educational culture, the whole darn thing changed. You didn't have to actually read it for yourself, because guess what? It got spell corrected along the way. In fact, it got grammar corrected. Did it? Everybody's had the little squiggly thing, right? You've seen the squiggly, the little squiggly lines. And after a while, if you really are a writer and you enjoy language, you gotta turn those things off. They drive you crazy. For one thing, there is something perverse about Microsoft Word. It doesn't like the passive. Maybe because it doesn't fit the proper sort of aspiring corporate model. We're active, we're to the future. But unfortunately, a lot of the people who use it are dull, like me. They sit there and they write academic essays. And one of the defining features of the genre of the academic essay is that we use the passive. That's because we're not super into going, it's your fault. We say, oh, there was a fault. You know, such and such was done by so-and-so. So we don't leap into those kinds of very secure and causal statements. We move carefully, very passively, okay? So what do? What we understand is that that little feature in the grammar corrector of your word processor is training people to write in a way that is distinctly not what we consider proper academic writing. This is to suggest, then, that there are things influencing the education of this generation of our nation of writers which are not our teachers. Not our primary teachers, not our elementary or our middle or our secondary or our gymnasium teachers or our university professors. No, they are software engineers. Have you ever met any? They're very exciting people. I love them. Yeah. Wow. Poetic inquiry. To experiment. And especially to experiment with form. To allow ourselves the liberty of nonsense. I know, you're thinking, that's all I have heard so far from you. I'm very good at it. Okay. Poetic inquiry, along with narrative inquiry, suggests that we can write to learn, and that we can discover what is going on by experimenting with the way we produce our texts. That unless we are willing to break out of the typical way of representing research and conducting it, we may not be able to see very deeply into the world we are trying to study. One of the disappointments for me in many of the conferences that I go to is that academics have spent a lot of time bowing to new technology. We will do what you say, oh Microsoft Word grammar checker. I will never speak another passive sentence. Or, from here on in, it's passive. I'm never going to write another. I'm just going to have a nice squiggly line. It's like going onto the ocean. It is an endless wave. Let me then try and present this idea, this new world of network literacy, governed, intermediated constantly by automatons, all automating everything we do. It may even disturb you to know that you can buy, if you are a student, and a lazy one at that, none of them here, of course, but you can buy essays. You probably know this. If you have an essay to hand in, you can go and buy it. And that you can buy automatically generated essays. That is, essays written by machines. Oh, okay. That's the world we're going into. Maybe we won't need to write anymore. And I hope we get to this topic. I will touch it briefly when we get to the idea of Google. But you know Google has cars. The Google car. You know about Google cars? Google has cars that drive themselves. Google's cars have now clocked in over 300,000 miles without a single accident, which statistically means they are better drivers than we are. And that shouldn't surprise you, right? You drove here today. So, what's happening? Already Mercedes-Benz is releasing on their top end cars that will drive themselves. Oh yes, you can still have the option of switching it into manual. But this is the beginning. Pretty soon, you will have to pay very high insurance premiums if you want to drive your own car, because it's inherently unsafe. You are a detriment to society as a driver. Oh. So pretty soon we will have a whole generation grow up who are not drivers. That means they will get into their car, tell their car where to go. Their car will answer them and talk to them, and the car will take them there. I am, of course, leading you toward a necessary conclusion, and we'll try and explore it a little bit. Do we still need to teach people to write? I mean, seriously, if within, say, 10, 20, 25 years, nobody needs to know how to drive, that will seem like dinosaur age. You know, that will be a topic for your essay. What it would have been like to drive a car. Awful, awful, awful. Road rage. If we apply that, do we still, why not? Let the robot write the essay for you. You will have more time, you'll be happy. Think of it. Think of all the time you sat there, oh gosh, rewriting, rewriting, rewriting. Oh, that's not right. Oh, that's not the good word. Oh, that's gone. Peace. Write me an essay on what it would have been like to drive a car. Right away, sir. Hand it in. Literacy education in 3 metaphors. The first is the garden. The garden, what a utopic, blissful, bucolic idea. Gardens are beautiful. I love gardens. You think of many, many early pedagogical works. In fact, if we look at the medieval times, we think of the Garden of Delights as one of our earliest medieval texts, compiled just south in France, northern France there. We think of perhaps Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm sure we could find a copy here. A Child's Garden of Verses. What's the idea of the garden? The idea of the garden is that everything is built within the human perspective. There's a path. It's built for you to walk on. It's not built for driving. There's no point in driving through the garden. Everything is within a part of an extension of the body, how we see the world. What's there? We have selected lovely, beautiful, flowering species, trees that are ornamental and gorgeous and change color over the time of year. These are beautiful ideas. Everything was within touch. We can smell it. Here's our literacy educator. For years, we were enticing the young student into the garden of great writing. In that garden, we weeded out all the stuff we didn't like. Yes, I know that's called censorship. We weeded out all that stuff, but what we put in there were beautiful works. Oh yes, over here, these plants are all from seeds of Søren Kierkegaard. Oh, that tree, that's Shakespeare. Here we are in the land of Hamlet. I just taught Hamlet. The idea is there's our garden. It was a prevailing metaphor for how we taught students. We brought them into the garden. We showed them around. We gave them some tools. They cultivated the garden. The teacher was a gardener. They helped to keep beautiful plants well in control, show people how to have a beautiful space in their heads. What did you do in the garden? So many gardens have that lovely sculpture of the thinker. Quiet, in repose, thoughtful, reflective, passive. Then we're going to come to part 2, and we start to think, and here, our garden, as we'll get to in a moment, is very organic. And the content of the thing is its form. There's our point. The content and the form are one. It's very different when we move into our mechanical age. This age is coming with the rise of public education. So, if we start somewhere in the mid-1800s, we see the rise of public schooling. We see the ideas of mechanization entering the world, but not just the physical world, but also the mental world. We see the car being developed. And what's key about the mechanical metaphor of the literacy education world is that we now divide the form from the content. That is, to drive the car, I don't need to know how to build it, right? To some degree, being a mechanic is a disappearing profession. Because what is the mechanic doing? The mechanic's off there fixing something. You know what they do with your car now. You drive it into the station and they plug it in and a computer talks to it. And it says, "What's wrong with you?" The computer's like Sigmund Freud. It psychoanalyzes your car. Your car responds by going, "I don't know, my carburetor feels a bit dirty." And they're like, "Oh." Actually, let's throw a new engine in. Charge you 5 times as much. Great. What are you? You are the driver. You don't need to know how that thing works. You just drive. For another 20 years. Number 3, we're going to move on. What is that word? I can't even read that thing. What is it? Who wrote that there? I didn't. It was a machine. Symbiote. Oh, yes, right, a symbiote. A symbiote coming from the idea of symbiosis. That in order to contribute to the new literacy environment, I am going to do it in partnership with my technologies, my devices, and all of them are governed by automated systems. All of it will be done. We'll be relating, the kids in the class, talking to each other. They already are, by the way. talking to each other while some kind of lecture is going on. In fact, why would we have the classroom at all? As you probably know, distance education, which used to be about writing things and sending mail, is now primarily about interacting online, almost exclusively done through automated mediation, almost exclusively. The learning is done with your robotic other, who's learning all about you, who's storing your information. Right now, it's just being carried around with us. We know that we are heading toward a time where we're just going to just put it in the head. Come on. It gets tiring. I don't care how small that thing is. My arm feels like it's longer than it used to be. Just put it in the head. Get over it, right? A symbiote. We will learn together. There it is. Right on. Child's Garden of Verses. What is the child doing? The child is learning how to grow their own plant. It's a beautiful, free version of Robert Louis Stevenson through Project Gutenberg. There we go. That's our engine. But it's our engine from the perspective of the literacy teacher. Okay? We're going to manufacture a writer. So we got a little word choice, which used to be thought of as a wall, engine wall, but let's call it word choice. We got some emphasis, a subject, we got their intonation, we got a verb phrase, predicate, register, content, da-da, boom. We are driving. Fantastic. There it is. There it is. Okay. That would, by the way, fail you in mechanics school. You're supposed to give other answers for those letters. Oh yeah, right, and then the digital. We are busy now trying to program the writer. So, what does this make our metaphorical teacher? It makes them a gardener, a mechanic, somebody who fixes all the mechanical errors. When we talk in English and we teach it, we usually assign the writing with a content constraint, write about what it would be like to drive. But that's not what we give back. What we give back is lots of circles with little acronyms that say like frag, awk, the great awk. Meaning, we comment on the mechanics of it. We try to help them by tuning their writing engine. That's the teacher, a mechanic fixing the kid's car so that they will be able to be better drivers of content. Now the teacher is more like a programmer, the programmers who work for Google, for Microsoft Word and those kinds of things. They've entered the picture. They have become a predominant force in how people learn. Let us remember that research used to be going to a place like this, looking through card catalogs for books. And we all know that you found something that was kind of what you wanted, and then you went to the stack, right? You went to the shelf, and you went along. And yes, you got that book, but 2 books over was the book you really wanted. It is the great thing about how they designed libraries. All hail Dewey Decimal System. Now, we don't. We Google everything. And Google tells us what we should look at. The problem is that Google uses probabilities based on all the other people who have asked for similar kinds of information and what they chose. Therefore, we homogenize the information we have. Because if your site about driving what it would be like to drive cars has already gotten 2 million hits, but a site that provides you in-depth information about the driving practices of the early 21st century has only gotten 100 hits, nobody will ever see it. It enters the landfill. That is the place we put the waste of the information environment and is gone. We don't know how to do otherwise. You don't have the time to go through every possible document. You need your automated search engine. Even the best academic researcher today, your scientists, your brightest thinkers, rely almost exclusively on online search engines, even when they are in the library. That means that we are prioritizing certain texts over other ones. And the choice is not necessarily being done by the expert community. It is the cumulative interest value placed on that text by all the users, especially the ones who don't like to read long texts. Great. So what does that make the metaphorical student? Well, we start with the thinker. Then we got the driver who drives the car of content, because we got our form, which is all that mechanics, that engine. And we've got our content, which is the fun you want, stuff you want to do. And now we have the user. So we've got our idea that now we still don't know anything about the way the thing works. It used to be you could go and tinker, they say, with your car's engine and fix things. Who does that with their computer? You got a problem with your computer, you don't pop it open the trunk of your computer, pull out some tools. More likely you bring a hammer and smash it because it's not working. No, we are users now. We are users. That's what we're called, by the way. When we interact with it, people develop user interfaces. That's how we get what we get. They are very good at providing user-friendliness, meaning don't think. Don't waste your time learning how this thing works. It has to be automatic, fast, instant. I want that thing now. It's got to be delivered to me right away. So what are our priorities? Right, we want to experiment with form. We want to push form and start to explore the possibilities of form because we are losing our understanding of form because form is always pre-formatted. It's the forms you enter online. Note, when you go to fill in the blanks in a form, the answers pop up for you. When you go to do your Google search, you type one letter, it gives you a list of things you probably want to ask. Not all of them are that good. Right on. Why? Because new forms are necessary for new knowledge. That's why we live in what we call the knowledge environment. That's we're in our knowledge age, our information age. But we're losing connection to the forms that we use to express ourselves. And that's where we need to start inspiring students, so that they're not simply slavishly following the forms that they are presented with. Because those forms now lack the depth of the great writer. They are cumulative, they are iterative, and they are usually given to you by automated others. They also usually involve visual and audio media. So we're not just talking about learning how to read. We need to learn how to read all the pictures, all the sounds. We interact with all these things. If you just enter a big sheet of text, nobody will read it. You'd better illustrate it. Some people might think that we're infantilizing people. Because if you want a kid to read a children's book, it better have pictures. Now, if you want an adult to read a manual or to read a textbook, it better have pictures. Even better if it speaks to you and reads the text to you so you can hear it rather than having to worry your eyes. Right. And because visual and audio media take lots of space, we need ever more space, more and more space. But it's not just hard drives that we need, it's the space. We are being inundated with information, what Todd Gitlin calls the media torrent, what Paul Virilio calls the information bomb is detonating in your mind every day. 86 billion email messages a day. Speed is the utmost priority in all of it. It used to be, if you remember from the old days, you had a modem. The modem, you wanted to load one picture, and it was done. You spent the rest of the day having coffee waiting for the picture to load in. Now, it better be there now, or you're finished. Like me. I'm already running out of time, and I could go on for a long, long time, as you can tell. I will end my talk with you today to suggest one thing about where we need to take writing pedagogy for the future. We need to give people basic forms to experiment with. The more they are able to take forms and to work innovatively with form, the more we will liberate their ability to imagine new content. We cannot wholly and totally rely on the automaton to do all of that for us. There is a value to the discipline learned in mastering form. I am not saying that every teacher should go off, get a stick, and beat students who are showing poor grammar. In fact, it would be much better if we allowed students to change the grammar to fit their world, but to do so by exploring it and mastering their own forms. I don't believe that the writing teacher's job is over. I don't think so. I don't think that because we have made it all easy, that we have solved the problem that has existed since writing has begun. That is the great difficulty of teaching people how to be good writers. We are not improving the quality of writing at present by relying on other things to do it all for us. What we are doing is damaging the individual's ability to explore and create new knowledge because they rely on something else to provide it quickly, thoughtlessly to them. Let us then, as writing teachers, take it on ourselves to become custodians of the information environment that our students produce. That means take care with the forms, work with all the material that is out there, apply the principles of recycling and reuse, rework it until it fits the forms and the expressions you want. Take nothing at face value, including your Microsoft grammar checker. I would like to thank you for having me speak with you today. Thanks very much.